Okay, in Vietnam, the victory of the communist leader Ho Chi Minh prompted intervention. Ho Chi Minh had northern Vietnam. The French had it divided on 17th parallel. U.S. was going to sponsor the new coalition of the new nationalist governments there. Vietnam is pretty much divided, and South Vietnam is going to become a U.S. puppet regime. It was originally under French control, but the U.S. will eventually take it over from the French. With containing China, we take a tough line against China. Hoped that a tough policy would show China that Russia was unable to protect their interests and drive a wedge between that alliance. Strategy will ultimately work. The U.S. had hinted at using nuclear weapons, and the Chinese did not want to test our bluff, so they stopped the attacks that they started on foreign islands. They're going to talk to the Soviets and realize that they're not really there for their allies, and so refusal of the Soviet Union to come to China's aid contributed to a growing rift between them. Eisenhower doesn't take full advantage of this opportunity. The USSR did not support China, but this did not open up any kind of relationship between the two countries. All right, in the Middle East, Suez Canal had been formerly under England and French control, and the Egyptian leader Nasser is going to take the canal in 1956 and nationalize it. England and France were dependent on that canal for their oil transport, and so they will launch an assault against Egypt as a response. They invade. Eisenhower becomes furious. He wanted a diplomatic solution, calls for them to withdraw. The U.S. sponsored a UN resolution condemning their actions. And so people kind of realize, oh, you stepped in between your best friends to help us. And so the U.S. might actually be able to be a mediator between two different groups, even if they have an alliance to one. Russia had also threatened to intervene. The success will win Eisenhower his second term. Lebanon invites the U.S. troops to come in to maintain order. That brings return of the U.S. to the Middle East. The nation had been divided, Christian and Muslim, threatening to launch a rebellion. Lebanon will ask for U.S. help and support after they had threatened basically a civil war. Marines are going to help to secure Beirut in 1958, reassuring troops are going to leave Lebanon by October, and helps to intervene and stop another war coming in, upholding our commitment to political stability in the Middle East. Central Intelligence Agency that we created under the National Security Act is going to be involved in covert actions. Eisenhower administration was trying to expand global influence, and Iran, the CIA, was going to restore the Shah of Iran to power, overthrowing the popularly elected government, putting the Shah in control. American oil companies get the rewards and benefits of that alliance. In Guatemala, CIA will mastermind an overthrow of a communist government in Guatemala in 1954, denying Soviets a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. An intervention in Cuba, they also try to assassinate Castro. Eisenhower's going to force Cuba into adopting a hard line against them and led them into the Soviet orbit, actually, which was not a positive outcome for that one. Eisenhower did remain calm in the crisis, but believed that the end justified the means in both Iran and Guatemala. For coming up with waging peace, October 1957, Russia was going to launch Sputnik. Eisenhower wanted to end the Cold War with the end of the arms race. Hydrogen bomb only intensified their concern. Both countries had long-range ballistic missiles at this point, tried to reason with Khrushchev, who had taken over after Stalin. When they launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth only, intensified that Cold War between the two countries. Fear of Russia ahead of the U.S. developing intercontinental ballistic missiles intensified. Like I said, Khrushchev is going to be elected the premier. He takes over after Stalin. Promised to continue with his efforts or to bear communism. October, U.S. and Soviet Union agreed to suspend nuclear testing in the atmosphere. Scientists had developed a system to detect testing in the atmosphere, and neither will resume during Eisenhower's presidency. In November, the Berlin blockade was threatened. Russia claimed they would sign a treaty with Germany and end Allied occupation after the war. The threat was going to get rid of all Western occupation of Berlin. Eisenhower tries to work a peace conference. In the meantime, U-2 incident happens. U-2 plane was a surveillance plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers, spying on the Russians, and after the Soviets realized what had been going on, any hope for negotiations is going to end. Tensions are going to keep going. Eisenhower, as he's leaving office, said to be wary of the military-industrial complex. Defense spending had skyrocketed. The increase in ICBMs and defense spending. As the post-war era is marked more like Cold War than peace and tranquility, trying to ease tension by Khrushchev's behavior. His behavior marks a time when Eisenhower's administration ends, and Eisenhower warns that to be careful of that growing tension between the two countries. All right, starting chapter 29, this is going to look at the post-war period. This is more the socioeconomic side, whereas 28 was more of the political side. 1945 to 1960, there's a lot of economic growth, high demand for consumer goods after the Depression, a steady rise in industry. There is a fear of another depression because it reminds people of the 20s where things got really successful really fast. The closer we get to 1960, the more that people's fears will be put at ease. Some of the things that will stimulate a growth in industry was the baby boom. It was a 19% growth of the nation during that decade. People have more kids because economic stability, more housing, younger marriages, which meant larger families. Couples could not afford families during the Great Depression, so now they're making up for lost time. The baby boom led to a housing boom, which led to a consumer boom, which led to a labor boom. There's 50 million babies born in 1945 to 1960. Led women's focus to be more on childcare and families and homemaking. Dr. Benjamin Spock is going to end up writing Baby and Childcare. It's the first study on understanding child needs. Population shift also to suburbia. It grew by 46%. And industry, appliances for the new homes, more cars, more transportation. We also have increased defense spending. The Cold War, Korean War specifically, led to a massive rearmament and an increase in military spending, government producing more munitions, first-generation computers. Military wanted new technological bells and whistles. And employment is going to expand. Yearly income goes up, people work less weekly hours, and not at all on the weekends. For the baby boom, 1957, one baby born every 7 seconds. Dr. Benjamin Spock, he was the pediatrician who wrote the first psychoanalysis on understanding child needs. For suburbans, there's a growth of suburbia and these cookie-cutter houses. For the first time, you could buy a house at a very reasonable rate. William Levitt produced 150 houses per week. That's why the suburbs got the nickname of Levitt towns. Same basic floor plan, few varieties, few outside facades. Built a lot of homes for people to live in and at an affordable rate as well. That was the basic floor plan, 2-bedroom, simple design. The political population distribution changing towards 1970, where suburbs and the rural areas are pretty much going to flip-flop their percentages. TV shows showing the quintessential home personality and family dynamics. Consumerism was huge during the 1950s. A lot of parallels between the 1920s and the 1950s. All right, post-war problems. Not everybody did well. Usually when other people are doing well, the farmers are not. Farmers were still having bumper crops, did not share in the affluence of the time period. Other industrial areas were declining. The New England industries, old industries, not doing as well, like the steel industry, not keeping up with national increases. We do have a slight recession or an economic slow during the decade. End of the decade caused some concern, but not enough to negate that the Americans experienced the highest standard of living in the world at this point. Incomes had doubled, as well as family sizes, and employees had vacation time. So overall, things were going very well. For life in the suburbs, it was pretty much completely the middle class, absent of the very rich and the very poor. Characteristics were dependence on the automobile. People were commuting over an hour to work. We also had to drive children to piano lessons, baseball games, and so you have the need for 2-car families, not just one. Family togetherness had been something that carries over from the Great Depression. People were so used to doing things together, and so they come from living with parents and in-laws and everyone doing everything together and taking that social tradition or trend into the 1950s. Traditional feminism was discouraged. More women found, since they'd gone to work during the war and they're returning home, right, the role of wife and mother. Ideal for the 1950s, you have this conflict of ideologies between those that think that wife and mother is the perfect role and those that want to be more into the workplace. The entrance of more women into the workplace stimulates the new feminism ideas. 1940, 1960, the number of women in the workplace will double. Expenses of raising a family lead to women having to supplement that family income. Car registrations from 45 to 60, more than double. 2-car families. Eisenhower, one of his most well-known domestic policies was the Interstate Highway Act. 41,000 miles of new highways built. Population was on the move in the 1950s. We have the rise of the Sun Belt. Americans going to warmer climates. California, Southern California. Disneyland will open. A lot of attractions in the southern areas. Interstate Highway Act was also the largest public works project in American history. Cost $32 billion. A lot of more convenient things to drive through. Food, movies. A lot of things revolving around the cars. Also with traveling for entertainment, going to Disneyland. Television becomes a huge part of the 1950s. 7,000 TV sets in 46. 4 years later, 50 million. A lot of the shows and movies personifying the ideal American values. Critics were very worried about the dosage of television on children's everyday life. A lot of things portraying different aspects of society. Teenagers. Teenager had entered American language by this point. 13 million teenagers had money to spend, places to go, music to spend it on. Elvis Presley, race music, rock and roll. A lot of icons that come out of the 50s with the changing music, and a lot of criticism on the principles that came along with rock and roll music. The Beat Generation, Beatniks versus the Clean Teens. The Beatniks, those that were opposed to the conformity of society, whereas the Clean Teens were all about living in the traditional values. Consumerism is the dominant theme in the 1950s. Highest quality of life, however, that sometimes leaves people very anxious and dissatisfied, nervous about what could be around the corner. Greatest areas of growth in the 1950s, church membership. The nation was divided, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish. Americans wanted a more personal religion. For school attendance, number of children in elementary schools increased from 20 to 30 million. Controversy over traditional education versus progressive. Foreign language, kindergarten. More young people were attending college. You have the GI Bill, 2 million GIs attending college after the war. Television watching on the rise, pushing aside radio, magazines. The shows had excitement, glamour, instant success, game shows, cartoons. Movie stars, and similar to the 20s, a lot of obsession with movie stars. Similar to the 20s, there's a lot of critics on the society and how it's going. John Keats had the crack in the picture window, endless rows of identical houses. William White, the organizational man, wrote about the loss of old Protestant work ethic and personal identity. David Reisman, the lonely crowd, wrote about the most significant one of the most significant works, setting the tone for the intellectual community, consumers who adapted behavior to conform to those social pressures. C. Wright Mills criticized corporations, saying that white collars were being outnumbered by blue-collar workers. Corporation was the villain. It deprived workers of their identity. Jack Kerouac, the beat artists, promote the counterculture, those who rebel against the materialistic society, seeking inner grace. This is going to be a prequel to the counterculture of the 1960s. Sputnik. When Russians launched Sputnik, the American response was suddenly technological leadership of the U.S. was put into question, declining economic growth, recession, concern over schools falling behind. The Americans are going to launch the Explorer. We also enact 2 new organizations, one's an organization, one act on spending. NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, authorizing Congress to compete with Russia in a space race. NDEA, National Defense Education Act, to upgrade the teaching of science, teaching physics, math. MIT is kind of controversial on the new math and new science ideas. Sense of failure will end up declining by 1960. People felt that America had lost its competitive edge with the easiness of affluence, but the fear of nuclear war intensifies because of missiles, thermonuclear warheads, and they're not having defenses, so we start to want to catch up in technology and science. Overall in the 50s, because it's a spirit of affluence and prosperity, there's not going to be any major domestic reforms in the post-war years. Truman does try to have some reform at home. He tries to expand the New Deal in his program known as the Fair Deal to increase minimum wage, extend Social Security, national medical program, federal aid to education, equal employment. Had very limited achievement, consolidating Roosevelt's reform and he's only going to really be able to set agenda for the future because Congress is pretty much going to vote down everything he tried to propose. He focused on too much at once.